Hello, and welcome to the latest in the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, or GFCRC's series of video conversations with stakeholders in the world of cybersecurity vulnerability research and disclosure. Today, we're joined by Stéphane Duguin. He is CEO of the CyberPeace Institute. Stéphane's based in Paris, and the CyberPeace Institute is a global non-governmental organization, or NGO, that's generally dedicated to increasing the maturity and trust in the digital economy and generally the digital space around the world. I would like to give Stéphane a chance to introduce himself. If you can talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what the CyberPeace Institute does, and how it ties into the GFCRC's mission. Then we can move on to asking you a couple of questions about the relationship and your interests in the GFCRC's approach to helping to strengthen and create a safer space for ethical cybersecurity researchers around the world. So over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, John, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate to this GFCRC podcast. I was originally in Paris long ago when I was still young and I would say beautiful, or not, in the beginning of my career. But now I'm in Geneva. So the CyberPeace Institute is located in Geneva.
My apologies. I'm Swiss, and our Romans sometimes like to think that they're part of Paris.
No, but it brings back a very nice memories. So it's again a pleasure to be here. Happy New Year to you. Happy New Year to everyone listening to us. And yes, to your questions, deciding at the time, some months ago, whether or not the CyberPeace Institute, a non-for-profit in Geneva, set up to defend vulnerable communities in cyberspace, would be interested and hopefully a good fit for GFCRC was a no-brainer. So mission of the CyberPeace Institute is to provide for free cybersecurity to the most vulnerable. We have a, for example, program where we provide free cybersecurity to NGOs. We have more than 200 NGOs that we are servicing in that way, but we are also conducting independent analysis on the behavior of threat actors, how they create human harms because of the abuse of technologies. And we look into how the regulatory landscape, the norms, the laws are providing enough security, safety, safeguard for everyone to enjoy a peaceful cyberspace.
Thanks for the introduction, and I apologize for forgetting to wish you a Happy New Year as well. And I did also neglect to mention that Stéphane is a member of the board of directors for the GFCRC. So it's a really good match, given that the coalition aims to support not only commercial actors, firms, but also universities and non-governmental nonprofit organizations in protecting themselves, their stakeholders, and the societies that they act in. I'm particularly interested in your organization, since I've spent a lot of my professional working life not only dealing with cyber threat intelligence, but also compliance topics, particularly in the industry association and NGO space. So it's really good to see the focus that the CPI has on, as you put it, protecting the most vulnerable. Very often what we've seen with especially NGOs is that they don't necessarily always have the resources or the knowledge, and thus they sometimes make easy targets for threat actors. Now, given your experience in this area, you guys have been running for a while. What can you talk about some of the challenges faced by the organizations that you serve in terms of managing their IT estate, particularly when it comes to having timely access to new cybersecurity vulnerabilities and remediation actions, patches, etc.?
Yeah, with pleasure. And in fact, we recently published a analysis of this threat landscape in which NGOs are operating. So we focus this analysis on NGOs in international Geneva because of our situation, but in fact, the findings can be applied in a broader context. What did we learn? That first, it was kind of a surprise, a good one, is that NGOs, for the vast majorities, do know that they are targeted by a very different shape or form of cyber attacks, and sadly enough, that they are targeted by the whole range of threat actors, being state-sponsored, criminal groups, activists, you name it. I mean, NGOs end up being targeted by everyone. Why? Because if you think of it, a non-for-profit NGOs, especially, and we have this specialty, we service the humanitarian sector, especially the humanitarian sector, is in field of operation that are highly sensitive from the geopolitical point of view, but at the same time, because they act in the context of crisis, crisis means emotions, and emotions means donations. So these NGOs also can be a very interesting blinking spot on the map for criminals, which are, after financial gain. So you end up with organizations that are normally not very mature when it comes to cybersecurity. Why? Because their whole operational model has been built on their operation and not on being cyber secure. That for a lot of them, they don't even have an IT department, let alone cybersecurity workforce. They are dispersed in terms of activities across the world, which complicates everything when it comes to interconnection, when it comes to securing data, when it comes from privacy to security, and are attacked by everyone. And that's quite unique in the world. So CyberPeace Institute, we decided to provide to these entities for free cybersecurity, from the knowledge to the threat intelligence to tools, but not only like, I would say, dry information, because if you would be advocate of the devil, you would say anyone today in the world can be cyber secure. You just have to Google it. You look online, and you're going to have all the best practices that you need to put in place. Is this solving the cybersecurity issue? No. So what we put in place, the most important, is workforce. It's time. What they are missing is people with talent and knowledge that can help them. So we have this program where we enact talent volunteers from the private sector. We have 45 companies that are providing to us for free cybersecurity workforce, and we map this workforce with the need of NGOs. And this is how we can scale this system.
I see some extremely fascinating parallels to the problems facing resilience building and vulnerability management, threat management for small and medium enterprises as well. These are generally not part of what you would consider critical national infrastructure. They also have the resource issues, and generally the knowledge is out there, right? There's ENISA, CISA in the US, other entities, NCSCs around the world have tons and tons of guidance, but very often these organizations simply don't have the manpower. I also find it interesting that you mentioned the state actors, because unless you are a large, very, very visible commercial organization, or you are simply one that is an opportunistic target for a profit and revenue oriented state actors, such as some of the North Korean groups, generally the state actors aren't going to go after you that much. So it's kind of this really troubling duality, or at least of the kinds of attackers that your stakeholders are going to be facing. One thing I want to touch on with the state actors is by definition, these are going to be fairly well resourced and fairly knowledgeable. So the topic of 0 days, whether exploiting ones that they've come across via darknet forums that contain a lot of state affiliated actors, or some that they've even come up with themselves, we've seen this in the past in a number of cases, is going to be a huge issue. Not to mention the fact that, as you say, a lot of the organizations you serve just don't really have the base level of cybersecurity awareness or maturity needed for more sophisticated attackers. So their vulnerability and patch management isn't going to be that great necessarily. How are we able to get, for example, vulnerability patches to these organizations quicker? Is there a way that we can help NGOs, and keeping in mind that nonprofit doesn't mean there's no money involved. As you mentioned, there's donations flowing through, there's lots of emotions involved. How can we help these organizations get access to, for example, security patches more quickly and effectively?
Excellent question. Allow me to share an example. So we have this community now of 200 plus NGOs that we are servicing with free cybersecurity. What does it mean? It means that we, and with the help of our volunteers, are proactively looking into the threats that these NGOs, are facing. So we look into very technical data feed, threat intelligence that we receive, that we gather. We connect unconnected data sets. And from these unconnected data sets, we get the real-time view on what is happening or supposed to happen to these NGOs. This allows us to provide to them alerts on things that they haven't seen. For example, their credentials are already out there in the open being sold. Or for example, they're running systems that have not been patched specifically for this and that vulnerability because they don't have time to follow on this. But beyond just giving this information, because then you end up on the NGO side, having your mailbox filled with red flag and alerts, and you cannot do anything about it, we match this with a person, with a volunteer that's going to help them to patch, to help them to look into, how to change the credential security for what has been leaked. And that's the game changer. And we discovered, and it was a bit counterintuitive, that in a world where there's a talent shortage when it comes to cybersecurity, but there's a lot of people out there with the heart in the right place who are willing to give their time for free to NGOs. We have close to 700 of them now, and we are going to scale this beyond the 1,000 easily this year. All of these are cybersecurity professional. No, not all of these are cyber professional in the wider sense. You can have data protection officers. I mean, privacy is quite important to the world of NGOs. It can be IT engineers, it can be infrastructure expert, it can be chief information security officers. They are giving 1 hour here, 2 hours there, 4 hours here, 8 hours here. And with that, we can scale a service to NGOs that was not existing before. And this virtualization is quite powerful, and it could go down to your question to the technical layer, implementing of patches, helping. We had a volunteer, last example, who helped a NGO to securely develop an app that is critical to their need. What is the need? The need is for underserved women in developing countries to have access to basic healthcare services. And their whole app environment is around this. When the app was developed, it was full with vulnerabilities. It was patched and put in place, at the standard by volunteers.
Have you had any interactions? I mean, obviously, on the topic of the GFCRC, right? This is the kind of the core idea that our activities are focused around is the need to have access to these kind of patches, to be able to find, communicate, and fix issues that are found inevitably in software around the world. Have you guys had any experience running into legal obstacles, or just simply nervousness around lack of clarity about policies surrounding vulnerability research, coordinated vulnerability disclosure? Was in your view, or even hypothetically, in your view, what are the obstacles that are facing these organizations getting access to quickly, because they're not that mature, they're easy targets, to the kind of fixes that, whether it's bespoke applications or commercial applications, when somebody does find and exploit some kind of a bug? Can you talk about some of the legal challenges, and you're interested in getting these things preemptively fixed so that vulnerability researchers can get, fixes out to, for example, your community?
With pleasure, and there's several layers to this. As mentioning to you, our program is built on contracts that we are securing with private sector entities, which decided to operationalize their corporate corporate responsibility into providing volunteers for these NGOs. But now liability comes into place, and they would be, to your point, extremely nervous if, for example, the volunteers would go into vulnerability disclosure and research in jurisdiction where this is not really clarified when it's legal or illegal. And that's the second point. For example, so I mentioned that in the beginning that we're not only in the free cybersecurity delivery for NGOs type of activity, but we also have a advancement of policy making stream of work. And in this context, we are following very quite closely the ad hoc committee for the cybercrime treaty. So here you have states, all the states, discussing about how to put in place a new treaty on cybercrime. And if you look deep in this treaty, the basic definitions are missing. So what is a crime? What is cybercriminal? and what is a researcher, what kind of activity are lawful when the researcher is doing it. And you end up having already a text today that is not providing any assurance of safeguards, of safe haven for those who today are looking into making the cyberspace more secure. And that's an issue. And the issue is indeed from the regulatory standpoint. As long as the states don't have the ambition to put a clear framework in place to implement this and to offer protection to the one who needs to be protected, and by doing this, by default, identifying everyone else who is just a attacker, and it's not that complicated, to be honest, this will not work. And today, the community of security researchers, I totally understand that it's a very complicated activity to put in place because they need to question themselves in terms of what is the jurisdiction I am sitting in? Is this legal what I'm doing or not? What is the jurisdiction where the data that I'm going to touch upon are situated? What is the jurisdiction in which the company is operating? It's not an easy maze to navigate.
I think that the jurisdiction point is an important one because especially when you're dealing with international NGOs, I mean, I assume from my anecdotal experience, a lot of these are based in Geneva or also places like Brussels, but you're going to have presence in a lot of jurisdictions where even in OECD countries or G7 countries, the distinction between run-of-the-mill cybercrime and legitimate interest vulnerability research is not always clear. Germany, a great example. But the moment you start looking at, for example, developing countries and these very, very heavy multi-jurisdictional approaches, it's going to get interesting just keeping track of what the laws are that govern technology vulnerability management or disclosure. So I appreciate that very much. I do
And
want to.
also just to comment on this, sorry to interrupt you for a second, but these organizations are using a complex supply chain of technical tools. So when you're looking your vulnerability research or disclosure, a lot of time you're not touching the infrastructure per se of that organization. You're touching a cloud-based infrastructure or a specific set of services that they are using. So this over-complexifies the problem of jurisdiction. Now, something that is, it's never, I will do it anyhow, but normally it's not a good idea to make parallel with real life when you talk about cyber, but let's try it. Wouldn't it be strange that people walking by a bank would see a group of armed criminals going into the bank, calling the bank itself or the police, and these people would be seen as accomplices because they fire the alarm, or that you see the building of a big corporation which is selling IT tools. You would see the building back office on fire, and you will call the fireman, and you would be then charged because you did that. Because it's actually the same logic in cyberspace. And how strange it is.
Sorry, I was looking at my mute button. What disappeared for a second. This is exactly the issue, because we are dealing with a huge continuum of levels of motivation for the people reporting the bank robbery, right? The people telling the neighbors, "Hey, your door is unlocked." Ranging from the completely malicious, which we don't care about, and they can be prosecuted and thrown in jail for all we care, to across the innocent, the curious, all the way to the professional. Let us actually help people figure this out. And I think the supply chain point that you made before is a really important one, especially with NGOs, because I mean, we are very often focused on commercial organizations, large international firms, even SMEs, when it comes to, for example, cloud service providers or software providers. In the EU, we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which as part of its provisions requires software publishers, importers, and distributors to implement a whole raft of measures to improve the cybersecurity risk situation of their products, but not really any coordinated approach to helping protect these. And I mean, the moment you have these massive international complex supply chains, you're going to have donors of services, you're going to have donors of software. I assume that's going to make things a lot more complicated when you have, some consulting firm in India or somebody in Australia or somebody in South America who's providing these services. If you are an NGO, you're probably also not going to have the legal resources to be able to navigate these or understand these. So this is, I think adding maybe another
Sure.
extremely challenging dimension of this already complex topic. Um,
It makes me think about something, sorry to build on this, is the challenges of open sources. Because the CRA, for example, Cyber Resilience Act, we issued a statement not so long ago about let's call it for what it is, the craziness of this idea of stockpiling vulnerability into a centralized database. But okay, I hope that someone is going to wake up there. But beyond this is how this obligation of reporting on vulnerabilities in a certain time frame, a certain quality level, is going to impact the open source community. I mean, the open source development of software, codes, etc. Today, NGOs and others, they are heavily reliant on the fact that still there's a very vibrant open source community, and there's a lot of open source framework upon which a lot of let's just take the internet as an example, is built. We need to be very careful also that regulation will not endanger this community and what it brings to. And that's a bit of the same logic with the vulnerability researcher. So instead of putting immense burdens in unclear definition, the whole point would be to protect these communities that are critical, that are addressing the core issue of cyber today, which is the lack of resources. You have people giving their time, giving their will in order to make the cyberspace better. Let's protect them, let's help them, and invest resources into prosecuting the bad actors. Because I've been in law enforcement for a huge part of my life, and I do know that the issue is not security researchers. The issue is the lack of resources for law enforcement and prosecutor to identify, arrest, extradite, and put criminals behind bars. That's
or
where
the
the issue.
lack of maybe ability to differentiate between different types of motivation. I mean, this is what we often see.
Really, maybe I've seen the wrong cases. I've done that for 15 years in my life, but I don't remember only one case where it was not really clear if the person was a security researcher or a cyber criminal. And I'm talking just about criminal groups. State actors are even easier because state actors, so it's clear. So, it's if it's there, it's marginal. And as usual, putting a lot of policy framework in order to solve a marginal issue is not looking at the forest behind the tree.
I think it's a fair point. This is kind of what I'm trying to get at with my differentiation issue. We have had a number of cases also in previous video conversations I've had where somebody was threatened with either civil lawsuits or also criminal consequences, not because the investigator or the prosecutor was malicious. Far from it. It was completely well-meaning, but they were either limited by the legal frameworks they were working under, or
Yeah.
simply by the lack of knowledge of what is an ethical hacker. Is there such a thing, right? It's your point. I'm reporting someone to the bank. If you're doing that to somebody who reporting a bank robber, you're doing that to somebody who doesn't know what a bank robber is. You might be mistaken for a bad guy.
And it's spot on, and it's about the lack of resources in the field of law enforcement and prosecution. Lack of proper regulatory resources, having the right framework with the right definition, and then down the chain implementation resources of these regulations.
I think that's something that, we're very much hoping that, for example, the OECD, the Digital Economy Working Party recommendations will help address. And, we've obviously seen some lights at the end of the tunnel. We keep bringing up the Belgian example of reforming the policies about vulnerability disclosure. I'll link to that as well. But there is some momentum that is appearing. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have this seeing this in some of the biggest economies like the US right now. It is very, as somebody who has the nonprofit space and the industry association space, particularly very close to my own heart, I'm hoping that this stakeholder group will see its interests represented, because as you mentioned again, the phrase "the most vulnerable," and you mentioned several times the lack of resources. I think this is something that especially in industry circles, is often overlooked and such an important part. Maybe not even necessarily in the developed world, as in parts of the world where these organizations are providing vital services to huge numbers of people. You know,
and it's about balance into how you, states put in place your regulation, the position that you take, and the budget that you spend. Let's take two fields. They could look about, but they are very connected. So the one that we're talking about, security researchers, and another market, because that's a market in this case, of developing, exporting, implementing, and selling spyware, offensive cyber capabilities. The offensive cyber capabilities markets solely exist because public money is poured into private entities, which job is to find vulnerabilities on the internet. That's it. They don't do anything else. They are stockpiling 0 days, they're exploiting 0 days, and they are selling this in a tool, weapon, you would say, okay, to states. How come that taxpayer money is very happily spent on that front? And how come that taxpayer money is not happily spent on protecting security researchers, which are not working for cyber insecurity, as the spyware markets, but they're working on cybersecurity?
I mean, the cynic in me will, you know, and obviously we had a number of very, very high profile cases over the last decade of, you know, also spyware providers commercial being hacked or otherwise negatively in the media. But the cynic in me will say that at least certain governments have less of an interest in helping increase the level of resilience and security in order to make their spyware more effective. But you know, obviously, that would be an extremely short-sighted approach, because you're putting the entire digital society, entire digital economy at risk, and undermining the very concepts of trust in digital institutions that let us do things like e-commerce or e-voting. So it's a very, very well taken point, and it would be nice to see, you know, I know that there's quite a few national cybersecurity agencies or similar agencies that are, you know, putting effort into at least guiding coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, having CVD programs themselves. But yeah, point very, very well taken, and very, very good that you brought this up, because having financial support for, or other support, material support for researchers to be able to do their jobs better would help everybody. Yeah, especially the ones that cannot, for example, afford to have these big vulnerability management programs in-house. So yeah.
Would demonstrate the seriousness and the goodwill of states in the context of check and balance, because there's this today initiative between the US, the UK, and France when it comes to the proper regulation on the use of spyware. I'm continuing on spyware for a second. This would be very interesting to have this. If it lands on a regulation, of course, needs to be regulation on this, but at the same time, to have the same kind of regulation to empower and to resource vulnerability researcher, because this comes hand in hand.
I think one thing that does need to be underscored and emphasized very, very heavily is that a lot of us, you know, not only commercial firms, as I mentioned before, but also governments and average citizens, don't understand or appreciate the importance and size of the nonprofit NGO sector, not just in their own countries, but generally around the world, in helping to improve social stability, economic prosperity, trust in institutions, filling gaps where these can't be filled. And if these kinds of organizations aren't able to protect themselves more effectively against the same level of cyber threats that, you know, the media makes a lot of noise about, justifiably, for the rest of us, then, you know, this gap filling capability around the world is going to be pretty dramatically undermined. So,
It's
you know,
very critical.
rational self-interest, if nothing else, right?
Indeed, it's very critical what you're saying, because we are servicing the one that have the closest of essential services. We are servicing organizations, social justice movement that are there where no one else is. So they are doing the work that you would imagine public sector should do, but it's not doing. And they are doing the work that first responders are doing, you know, after a earthquake, after a drought, in the COVID-19, after the invasion of a country. I mean, that's where the work is. So our ambition is maybe a bit crazy, but it's good to have a mission, I guess, is to transform this sector into the most secure sector of all, in front of finance, in front of critical infrastructure. We don't mind, that's the ambition, because we consider that it's critical to essential services all over the globe.
And I think that's where it should be. I come from I come from the very naive idea that there shouldn't be a most secure or a less secure. There should be everybody is secure. But yeah, I also want a pony for my birthday. So, with that, I would like to wrap up and thank you very, very kindly and sincerely for taking your time out of your busy schedule. I know you're all over the place with limited resources. With that said, a very, very blatant and enthusiastic plug for the CyberPeace Institute and their activities. Give them a visit. I will link to their website in the video description. Give them some money. There's a donation link. Get engaged. It's a very, very worthwhile organization with a tremendously important and admirable set of activities and objectives. The fact that you said, let's make this the most secure sector is already, for me, a very, very positive sign. It speaks of a tremendously, optimistic ambition that I think is extremely admirable and deserves a lot of support. Please also don't forget to visit and ideally join the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition. We'd love to have you as a member. We need your support. Like, share, subscribe. Follow us on LinkedIn. Follow us on Substack. And with that, I want to wrap up. Thank you. Wish you a warmer than it is right now, January. Wish you a not 2023, 2024. May it be a good year for everybody involved. Stay safe, stay secure, and talk to you soon. Thank you, Stéphane.
Thank you so much, John. Bye-bye. See you.